Hello, everyone. I am Sam Taylor, and I'll be leading this session today on fantasy world building, one of my great writing passions. I am a fantasy author myself. My debut novel, We Are the Fire, was released this past February. This is a young adult dark fantasy. I've also started working on some middle grade fantasy as well for the 8 to 12-year-old audience. So that's kind of where the bulk of my examples are going to be coming from today, young adult and middle grade fantasy, since that's my biggest area of expertise. But any of the principles of world building that I'll be talking about today can be applied for adult fantasy as well, since you got to be thinking about kind of the same elements when you're putting together a world, whether it's for children readers or whether it's for adult readers. So there's me and my first book baby. We Are the Fire, as I mentioned, it's a young adult fantasy for the teenage reader audience. And this book in particular is about two flame-wielding teen soldiers in love who are pitted against each other as they fight against the empire that kidnapped them as children. So today, as I talk about world building, I'll be kind of walking you through my process of how I put together the world for this story. And I'll also be showing some examples of exceptional world building that I found in works from other authors as well. Before I dive into the world building steps, I do want to point out there's no one right way or place to start building your fantasy world, but there are elements you want to consider each time. So the order that I present the steps here doesn't have to be the order that you take the steps. This is kind of the order that I followed for building We Are the Fire. And you might, as you're building your own fantasy worlds, you might approach the steps in a different order, but everything I talk about today is something you'll want to be considering about some point as you're building the fantasy world, whether it's in the initial brainstorming and outlining and drafting, or whether it comes to revisions and you realize, oh, there's a few more elements of the world building I need to consider to make sure that this world is really fully fleshed out and well-rounded, even though we're building fantasy worlds, maybe completely made-up worlds, elements of magic, things we don't find in our world. We still want them to feel real, immersive, someplace where the reader could see themselves walking through so that they can become fully invested in the world and the characters' journeys through them. So We Are the Fire. A lot of people ask me, where did you get the idea for this book? How did it start? There's a lot of different ways all the writers start their books. Sometimes you start with a character and you see a character just comes to your mind and you want to follow them through a story. Sometimes with fantasy, you get an idea for a world or a magic system that's so compelling, you want to craft a story around it so you can explore that further. Sometimes you might see some scenes or some plot points and they kind of start falling into place in your mind in a story, and you want to continue building a whole story around those scenes so that you can write those exciting events. For me, We Are the Fire started with an emotion. I was really angry and I wanted to watch something burn. The day job that I had at the time was run by some pretty corrupt people. I wanted to make the situation at work better. I wanted to fix some of the wrongs that were happening, but I wasn't really sure how. Uh, the one person who was in the best position to help us out didn't want anything to do with the problem. I wasn't always sure who else I could turn to. I wasn't even always sure who I could trust. I didn't always know what the right steps or answers would be. Um, and I would come home from work so frustrated every day. I started turning to writing as a way to get out some of my emotions and my feelings in a more healthy venue. And toward the end of my time at this job, when my frustrations were reaching a peak, I had this idea for fire magic, because again, I wanted to watch something burn, and I saw Oksana, one of my main characters, and I was just picturing this young girl with the power to burn. And I thought, okay, I need to figure out why she's burning. I need to figure out where she is, what's going on. So this book started with an emotion. There's a quote from the book: "She knew her work. She would crush him." Not talking about Prawn, by the way. The other main character in my book, though they do have a lot of tension and conflict between themselves throughout the story, but that was the emotion that planted the seed for this story in my mind. So as you are building your fantasy worlds, you need to think about, what is the premise for this story that is coming to your mind? Is it also being driven by an emotion? Is it being driven by a question you have, maybe about something that has been troubling you in your life, something that has been troubling you about the world? Could be a philosophical question. It could be like a what if question. It's an idea for a magic system you have, maybe one you've never seen in a fantasy story before, that you think would be really fun to work out, figure out the rules. What can you do with this magic? What kind of things could a character achieve for themselves? What kind of trouble might they get into? How could it empower them? How could it hold them back? Could be a really cool setting or an aesthetic that has captured your mind that you want to explore more in a story. Again, it could be a plot point, or it could be a character that comes into your mind and just won't leave you alone, and you want to build a world around this character and see what they could do in the story. But every story starts with some sort of a seed or an idea, and take some time to think about, what's the seed for your story? What is the pivotal point for it? And then you'll start building your world around that. You want to be designing a world that supports and also challenges the premise, because keep in mind, there's the plot that happens. The character is trying to achieve something. They want something. Someone or something else is standing in their way. They have to go through a series of obstacles until they achieve, or they don't, the goal that they've had at the beginning of the story. Maybe they get exactly what they wanted. Maybe they realize they actually wanted or needed something different all along and end up getting that. So there's the external arc of the plot, but the character also has to have an internal journey. They're a different person than they were when the story began. And so you want to be designing your fantasy world to help support your character on this journey, and that also provides the challenges and the obstacles that they need to change who they are as a person, so that by the end of the story, they're a different person, often a stronger, better, more insightful individual. And a good way to start building these worlds is to interview yourself about the world. Ask yourself questions that expand on that premise. I toyed around with a lot of different ideas, and some of them I had to ask myself as I was building We Are the Fire. I was like, what kind of a world would have teenage soldiers with the ability to control fire and to literally fight with fire? What kind of a world would have teenagers in their army in the first place? What kind of world would choose to fight other nations with fire versus any other weapons? And what kind of a world would be turning their soldiers into human weapons? And how did the people of that nation view these human weapon young soldiers? Were they heroes? Were they terrified of them? Were they happy to have these children fighting for them? you interview yourself, you ask questions to really kind of get at the heart of what is this world that you're creating? What's driving it? How is it working? Why are things the way they are? We'll look at more ways to pick apart these questions and to really get to the heart of your world. So when you're building a fantasy world, one of the very first things you'll want to be asking yourself when you start with the world building is, are you going to have a secondary world, or is it going to be grounded in some kind of reality in our world, whether it's a little bit different or not? Secondary fantasy world, it is a completely new world that you are crafting from scratch. Basically, you get to be God for this fantasy world. Everything for it comes out of your mind. And it's very freeing. There's so much room for creativity in a secondary world fantasy, because you get to completely craft the kind of world that you envision that you need for this story. You don't have to be limited by our world's history. You don't have to be limited by the geography or the location of how another city is made. You know, if you need a university on that corner and maybe there wasn't one in real life, but you're making a world, you can put whatever you want around. There's so much room for creativity and possibility, but it comes with a lot of responsibility too, because it's up to you to come up with everything for that world. You have to think about the social structure, the economy, the history, the um, the the roles that the people have in society. How do they make their living? How does their government run? And you have to make sure it all makes sense and is logical. And you have to think about how the way that world runs, how that affects the people, how it shapes your character's life and their goals that they are following in the story. So it's very freeing, so much room for creativity and to make the world exactly what you need to be for your story. But it's something that also takes a lot of work as well. Alternate world fantasy. So it's our world, but with a twist. Maybe you've made some changes to history and altered the outcomes of some historical events, and that's where the fantasy comes in. Maybe you're attributing some historical events or inventions to magic. There's something about it that you've changed, and this is also a really fun way to build a fantasy world. I've written an alternate world fantasy with the story that got me my agent, an Icelandic historical fantasy where I say that the Viking Age magic that the original settlers of Iceland believed in, that you can find in all the Icelandic sagas, it still exists in this 1904 Iceland world. And the magic is, of course, all regulated as part of why Iceland was eventually able to get their constitution. So I'm playing around with the real 1904 Iceland and Reykjavik and how they were trying so hard to get themselves into the modern world and caught up with the technologies that were happening at that time. But there's also these Viking Age magicians running around the city, selling their spells and causing havoc with some of their spells. And it's just a fun what if way to envision the world. And see what might our world be like with a little bit of magic thrown in. Then there is solid real world fantasy. You often see this with contemporary but it can also be in historical fantasy, where it is the world as we know it or the world as it was. And the magic in these worlds, it's usually a hidden magic, like a secret society of magicians or witches, and they have to keep their magic on the down low for whatever reason. Maybe people would panic if they knew about the magic. Maybe it's secretly how they built themselves up a lot of power. So 3 different ways you can approach the world building. None is better than the other, none is worse than the other. It's just very different ways to approach the story. And so it is one of the first things you need to think about. And consider what kind of a world do you need? What kind of characters are you writing about? Which of these approaches would best serve the story that you're needing to tell? Early on in the world building process, you're going to want to visualize your world as well, whether it is a secondary world fantasy that you are completely crafting on your own, or whether it is set in our world. You want to have a clear mental picture of what this place looks like so that you can really put down some immersive descriptions and depictions on the page and get your readers feeling like they're walking through this world, they're living it, they're breathing it, they can smell it, they can feel the things that the characters are touching, they're walking that path along with the characters. Some ways to do that: map it out. At some point, you would want to either look at a map of the setting of the story, if it is set in real world setting or an alternate world setting, or if you are completely building your own world, you might want to sketch out, especially if you have multiple countries happening in your story. The characters, maybe they're traveling, maybe there's characters from different parts of the world. Sketch it out, give yourself an idea of what this world looks like, where the people are coming from, consider the geography. This is a map I made for We Are the Fire. A black and white version of this appears in the book itself, but I'm showing here the Vesiman Empire and the enemy nation Skamel that drives so much of the conflict in Vesima and what they're trying to fight against, why they created their fiery army in the first place. And you have up on the upper right corner, you have the tundra, the frozen tundra nation of Nida. And you got the Vesima, the nation behind the fire army, the nation that's causing all the trouble in the story. It's a country of rivers, of mountains, of the very Kiwi mines. And below that one, you got Horadim. It's a country of mountains, a country of farmers. It's a quiet rural nation. That's where Oksana's from. She's a farm girl. Down below that, you have Pakastra, a tropical nation, jungles, rivers, lots of rain. It's where Prawn is from. But it's fun to just map it out, kind of get an idea of the landscape that your characters would be familiar with, map out the cities that you're talking about in your story, just block out the layout of the world, get a feel for the landscape your characters know. How to build your map? You can start as simple as pencil and paper. I did when mapping out We Are the Fire. Have a paper map up on my wall, the very original, very early and basic version of the map that I just showed you. Also mapped out the city as well. They go through the capital city of Menich so many times. So I mapped out all the places that they visit, kind of to keep it organized in my own mind, so that as I'm writing the chapters and the story events, I'm not confusing myself or the readers on where things in the city are located, describing well how the characters are moving through the city to get to the different places. So you can start as simple as pencil and paper. It does not have to be fancy. It just helps you get a view of the setting your characters are moving through so that you can describe it well from scene to scene. If you're looking for something a little bit more fancy or elaborate, maybe like me, you are creating a map that will actually go into your book, then there's a couple other programs. I used WonderDraft to create the map I just showed you. It is a $30 one-time fee for the license, and it comes with commercial rights. So anything that you create in that program, if you've bought the license, then you are allowed to print it, distribute it in books, as swags or posters or items. I was really impressed with the professionalism of the WonderDraft map, like I just showed you. It takes a little bit to learn, but it is very easy. It's very user-friendly. to create the landscape. You can just kind of, they have little tools that allow you to easily sketch it out on the page, to carve the land into whatever shape you need it to be. Then there's essentially little stamps to create the mountains, to create the cities, mines, fortresses, anything that you need for a larger worldview map. You can draw out rivers, you can color code the lands like you saw in mine, shade the different greens, the whites for more frozen landscapes, greens for the farms and the forests. Very easy to use. I do highly recommend Wonder Draft, and you can find that online easily. Another one is Incarnate. I didn't use this one, but I had it recommended to me by a few other of my author friends. It is free to use for a personal license. So if you're just looking to make a map for your own use, that would be like for your own eyes only, or to share with friends who are helping you world build or reading your manuscript, you can use it for free. If you want a commercial license, it's $5 for a month just to use the program for a month, $25 per year. And again, you could use those maps. They could appear in your books. You can put them on your website. Very great tools, inexpensive, and produce some excellent quality maps. Another way to visualize Pinterest boards. And I know it's kind of a joke among some authors in the community. We will talk about wasting time on Pinterest. For me, in the very early stages of brainstorming and world building, it's not a waste of time. I always build a Pinterest board for every story I work on. It really helps me get a good picture in my mind of the different settings and landscapes in the stories. I'll also find pictures that of people who look like the characters, and I'll refer back to these often. I'll even print out the pictures and put them on bulletin boards in my office. It's a quick, easy way for me to just take a look at these pictures I've gathered that are a visual representation of my story. Take a look at them, and boom, I'm there instantly in the world. A good way to get myself in the right headspace for writing. So I absolutely built one. This is still up on my Pinterest. I've made it public. So you look me up, Sam Taylor, on Pinterest, you can see this board for We Are the Fire. And it was just how I helped get the wheels rolling in my mind to visualize the story I was creating. Also, another tool, it's very useful, especially if you're working on alternate world fantasy or real world fantasy, Google Maps. So if you're writing about a setting that you don't live in, highly encourage you to go visit that setting, walk around in it, experience it yourself, feel what your characters would be feeling as they move around in it. But travel can be expensive. It's not always in the budget. And especially as we're coming out of these pandemic and COVID times, it hasn't always been possible to travel, and it still isn't in some cases. So don't underestimate the power of Google Maps. I made big use of it myself for my Icelandic historical fantasy that I'm working on with my agent. I did eventually get to go to Reykjavik and walk around there thanks to some of the money from my advance for selling We Are the Fire. But before I got to visit Reykjavik in person, I was on Google Maps all the time, looking at the city, like seeing where different things were located, different buildings and historical sites that I actually have as settings in various scenes in my book. I was looking at street names, making sure I was referring to actual streets, poking around and just getting a feel for the distances from places, how quickly and easily my characters could have moved from one site to another. With Google Maps, often you can even zoom in to a closer street view and swivel the screen around. So it's like you're standing there in the street and you're looking around at the buildings. it was a huge help to me, so much that when I took the story to different critique partners of mine for feedback, some of them who had been to Iceland and to Reykjavik, and they came back to me and said, I can't believe you haven't actually been to Iceland yet, because it feels like you have. You've nailed the setting so well. It's all thanks to Google Maps. Do not underestimate the power of this tool. So obviously, if when you're doing the fantasy world building, in addition to the secondary world or real world, and visualizing it, you're going to want to figure out pretty early on what your magic system is going to be. Now, I do want to point out, not all fantasy stories have to have a magic system. Many do. It's not a requirement. For instance, Marie Rutkowski's trilogy, the Winner's trilogy, starting with the Winner's Curse, no magic system. It is in a completely made up world inspired by ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So completely made up world, but no magic system. Phenomenal fantasy. The story doesn't need one to be compelling, to be fantasy. But many fantasies do have magic. I personally, all of my fantasy stories have magic. I've tried writing stories without magic. Doesn't work for me. My brain just loves the fun and the possibility of magic. But if you have a magic system in your story, you got to think about who has the magic. Is it something that everybody has? Is it something that only a select few people have? You got to think about, where does this magic come from? Are they born with it? Is it something that can be acquired or taught? Is it something that they are transformed to have? Who has the magic? Where does it come from? What are the social standings of those with magic? Are they revered? Are they respected? Are they powerful? Or are they pariahs? Are people afraid of them? Do they not trust them? Are they considered manipulative or dangerous? Think about what best serves the story that you are trying to tell. What would most empower and challenge these characters who you're following in the story? How do they need to grow and change? And how does the magic that either they have or that the people around them have shape their lives, their story, their needs, and their goals and their motivations? Think about how the magic affects the world too. Is it part of their economy? Is it part of their social structure? How has it shaped their history? How has it shaped the way that people interact with each other? If you have a magic system, you need to think about what the world is like because of this system, what the characters are like because of this system. How do they understand themselves and the people around them? How does it shape what they want and who they want to become? I'm going to look at an example now from a story that I think has a really unique and creative magic system. This is a middle grade fantasy that was released, I believe, just last month. It's a very new release. I'll be honest, I picked it up because look at that stunning cover. I saw that cover. I knew I had to have the book in my hands, and ended up thoroughly loving it. It's about star magic and astronomy and so many things that I already love. So the premise in this story, it follows an almost 13-year-old girl named Ivy, and her mother and her two aunts are fallen stars that fell to Earth, became women, and their responsibility now is to take care of the natural magic in the Earth. So Ivy says about her family, even though Daddy was a travel writer, Mama's work was the real reason we lived on the road. As a fallen star, it was her duty to tend to the magic that wove underneath the world, whispering to it when it was weak and scolding it when it became unruly. Without fallen stars, she had told me for as long as I could remember, the magic would all disappear, and with it would go all the things that made life worth living. Long ago, when they had first fallen to earth, Mama and her sisters had lived together in a cottage in Whistling Ridge, North Carolina, a little apple orchard town tucked into the Appalachian Mountains. But eventually, they'd realized that it was too hard for them to touch the magic of a whole country from one house. And so Aunt Agatha had stayed in Whistling Ridge to care for the East, and Aunt Ruth had moved to Montana to care for the West. And Mama had married Daddy and bought a Winnebago camper so they could live on the road and tend to everything in between. And I just loved this presentation of magic in the story. Um, Ivy doesn't have magic. It's her mother and her aunts who have the magic. But what a fun concept of these fallen stars who come to Earth. They're trying to take care of the natural magic in the environment, and what happens when things start going wrong. What happens when the stars can't keep up with all the demands and all the changes of the environment around them. And what would it be like growing up as the daughter of a fallen star and never having one single home, because your mother has to constantly be on the go, traveling around the country, taking care of everybody else's home. And that's the struggle that Ivy faces in her story. Is she wants a forever home, but her mother's responsibility is to basically everyone else's home. So for We Are the Fire, I had to answer all of these questions for myself as I began working on the story and the brainstorming. Who has this fire magic? What is their social status? How did they get the fire magic? As I've mentioned, the army is made up of teenagers who have the power to fight with fire. They from a single spark and from their breath, they can create enormous bonfires, and they use these to fight for the nation of Vesima. I knew I didn't want them to be born with these powers. They were given these powers, or rather, they had these powers forced onto them. As children, they were kidnapped. Their nations were conquered by Vesima. They were taken as tribute and kidnapped from home, made to join the army, and they were transformed through alchemical processes in order to be able to have the power over fire. So once upon a time, they were just ordinary kids living their lives in their home countries, were taken away by no choice of them or their parents, and made to fight for a country who decided that they now own them and got to decide what happened with their lives. Spent some time researching alchemy as it had happened in our world's past, and then I played with it. So some of the chemicals that are mentioned in We Are the Fire in the alchemy lab, they were real ones used in alchemy in our world, but I also made some up. Because in this world, the alchemy, it's not about changing metals into gold or making an elixir of life or looking for a philosopher's stone. It's about transforming ordinary kids into these fire-wielding demons. So I made up a Verakivi stone, a bright red, very incendiary stone, which is a key component in the alchemy that gives these kids the power over fire. Another thing you're thinking about, so you've got secondary world or real world fantasy. You got the setting and the landscape. You want to be thinking about the time period as well. Is this a story that takes place in the past? Is it happening right now? Is it even happening maybe a bit in the future? Think about the technological and the social advancements that are present in each times. What do you need for this story you're trying to tell, for this world that's starting to take shape in your mind? For We Are the Fire, it's set in a time that's sort of on the cusp of industrial revolution in this world. So it kind of has like one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world. They're still obviously still working alchemy, which is a little bit of an old world science. But there's a steam train, which plays a part in the story, and they have telegraphs, which also play a part in the story. Um, Decades ago, the default for fantasy tended to be this kind of like a medieval type world, a pseudo medieval world. Don't feel that you have to limit yourself to that. We have a whole range of time periods. I mean, I've seen fantasy books set in the Stone Age, in in beyond ancient times. So give yourself the freedom and the creativity to think about what time period would best suit the story you're trying to tell, best suit the characters. What time period do you see them living and breathing in? And what time period would also challenge them the most and push them to want the things you see these characters wanting, um, and push them to become the kind of people they need to be at the end of the story. Think about the society and the culture that you see these characters taking part in as well. Often in fantasy, you'll see the author using real countries or cultures as analogs for the world that they are creating. Even in secondary world fantasies, you'll see this. Sometimes like the author will be like, this is a French inspired society, or this is an Eastern European inspired society. I do want to have a word of caution. You want to be very, very careful if you're using a culture or a country as an analog that is not a culture or country that you come from, that you grew up with, that you have experience with, that is part of your ancestry and your heritage. And I say this because it can be very easy, if you are trying to base a world on a country or culture that's not your own, it can be very easy to start cherry picking things that seem cool to you. You're like, oh, I like that aesthetic, or I like this or like that. And you start cherry picking things without understanding the cultural significance of those elements, or what they mean together, how they play into each other. And you can present a world that ends up actually being very fragmented, very disorienting to the people who are of those cultures and countries. And it could even be disrespectful of the culture, picking things apart without understanding the significance and meaning behind them. So be very careful using real cultures as analogs when they are not your own. An alternative to that approach would be to consider an element that's crucial to your story world and build the culture and the society around that. Is it a society that lives in the mountains? Is it a society that lives in a forest or in the desert or by the sea? Is it a society that's surrounded by snow 9, 10 months out of the year? What would that do to the society? How would the society, if they're a mountain society, then what would their culture be arising from rocks and trees and high elevations? How would that shape the way they understand the world? How would that shape their foods? How would that shape their traditions, their festivals? How would that influence their religion? All of those things can come together to create a really unique culture that is the center of your fantasy world, and that is not in any other story that may be unlike anything readers have seen. One book that I think does this really well is Aaron A. Craig's House of Salt and Sorrows, that has a very sea-based culture. Everything from the way that people view themselves to the religion and the different gods are all drawn from this society that is very maritime based. They're right there on the sea, and the sea is basically their world. It's their source of life and their source of understanding the world. So let's take a look at an excerpt from Aaron's book. So this is from the very beginning, the very first scene of the story. It's taking place at the funeral of the main sister's character. And that's not a spoiler because, again, this is the very first page of the story, but her older sister has just died and she's at the funeral. We, the people of the salt, commit this body back to the sea, the high mariner intoned as the wooden box slid deep into the waiting crypt. We are born of the salt, we live by the salt, and to the salt we return, the high mariner continued. To the salt, the mourners repeated. As Papa stepped forward to place 2 gold pieces at the foot of the crypt, payment for Pontus for easing my sister back into the brine, I dared to sweep my eyes around the mausoleum. It was overflowing with guests bedecked in their finest black wools and crepes, many of them once would-be beaux of Eulalie. She would have been pleased to see so many broken-hearted young men openly lamenting her. Annalie, Camille whispered, nudging me. To the salt, I murmured. I pressed a handkerchief to my eyes, feigning tears. And I love the world that Aaron Craig presents. You know, they call themselves the people of the salt. They're the one heading this funeral, the high mariner. I mean, what a really compelling and atmospheric way to open this story, to demonstrate how these people truly view themselves as people, children of the salt and of the sea. Language creation resources. So if you're looking to create a language for your unique fantasy world, it's a daunting task, yes, but there's many resources out there to help you. And these are all online, available for free. If you simply Google them, excellent ways to help you, whether you're looking to build a whole language or whether you just want a few keywords or phrases to have and sprinkle throughout your book to give a flavor for this world that you're creating. So there's creating a fictional language for your fantasy world, 3 easy steps to crafting a language, and then this excellent one, the last one, the language construction kit. So, I mean, you can go ahead, feel free to screenshot those, write them down. If you Google them with the name of the creator, you'll find them online. Very, very helpful. As you are building your world, you want to think about not just the here and now of your story that's going to be presented on the page for your readers, but you want to spend a little bit of time thinking about a history for your world. How did it get to be where it is now? Though this information might not actually end up on the pages of the story itself, it's important for you as the author to know, because the history of the world is going to shape the way the character society understands itself and how the society got to be the way it is now, which will shape the characters' views of themselves, will shape their expectations. It's going to shape it's going to shape how what they want. It'll shape how they think they can go about getting what they want. But another word of caution, if you're going to include any kind of marginalizations or oppressions or biases or bigotry in your world, before you do that, stop and think about why. What are they going to serve in your world? How do they shape your characters specifically? How do they contribute to the world, to your characters' struggles? How are you unpacking them and presenting them on the page? And think above all else, are you the right person to be writing a story addressing these particular marginalizations or oppressions or biases, because sometimes they can be put in a story out of good intentions. You think, I'm going to try to send a message, but it can be very easy, especially if you're coming from if you're not coming from that marginalization, if you're coming from a more privileged aspect of society, it can be easy to get it wrong, and it can be easy to cause harm. Got a quote here I'm going to look at that I found on Twitter recently, just some food for thought. There are no obligations to portray racism or any bigotry in fantasy or sci-fi. Many privileged authors get it wrong, and many marginalized readers needn't the pain of real life in fiction. If you can bend the laws of nature in a book, you sure can skip the horrifying laws of humans. So as you're building your society, if you are going to include any kind of like racism, or any other kinds of bigotry, really think about, why are you doing it? How is it contributing to the story and to your character struggles? Are you unpacking it? And are you the right person to be putting those marginalizations and those oppressions on the page? An example of a story that does an amazing job presenting historical background for the world that it's creating is Justina Ireland's Dread Nation. So this book, it's set in an alternate post-Civil War America. And the premise of it is that in the middle of the Civil War, at the Battle of Gettysburg, the undead rose up and completely diverted the war, because the armies now had to fight these zombie shamblers, as they're called in the story, and stop them from basically turning the United States into a nation of zombies. It is an amazing book. I'm generally not a big fan of zombie stories, but the voice and the world building of this story and the way it goes about just presenting this alternate America of zombies, always, on the brink of the wilderness and breaking into society. It's just so well done. So I'm going to look at an excerpt of this is the main character, Jane, talking about how the zombies rose up and how the nation chose to address this issue of zombies potentially attacking any city at any time. During the Great Discord, right after the dead began to walk and before the army finally got the Shambler Plague under control, the building was empty. This is the school. She is part of a school that trains teenagers to fight and to protect people from the Shamblers. And these schools are specifically for Black and for Indigenous American children, training them to fight so that they can protect the more privileged white society. Back then, people weren't so much worried about education as they were not having their faces eaten by the undead. But then as the cities were cleared out and recaptured, folks got civilized once again. Shortly thereafter, Congress funded the Negro and Native Re-Education Act, and dozens of schools like Miss Preston's were created in cities as large as Baltimore and as small as Trenton. The minority party in Congress was against the combat schools from the start, saying that Negroes shouldn't be the ones to fight the dead, either because we're too stupid or because it's inhumane. But once the act was passed and the schools were established, there wasn't anything they could do, even if they'd wanted to. The federal government is the law of the land, but it doesn't have much say in how things are truly run within the walls. Most cities are small nations unto themselves, with the mayors and their councils in control. And anyway, I don't much mind the schooling. Those congressmen probably ain't seen the dead shambling through the fields for years, going after folks trying to eat them. But I have. If I can get training on how to keep everyone back home at Rose Hill Plantation safe, then why shouldn't I? In addition to creating a history for your world, you're going to want to think about a folklore for your world too. And I love folklore, looking at folklore throughout our worlds and building it for fantasy worlds, because folklore is the stories that people tell themselves to understand their world and explain the world to them. I mean, you think about folklore and fairy tales, these are the stories that we grow up hearing from the time we're very young children. And they have a big impact in how you understand the world around you, how you understand yourself, what you begin thinking is possible, and what you begin thinking is impossible. Very influential, very important. So spend a little bit of time just telling yourself stories about your world. What are the kind of things your characters would have grown up hearing, and therefore start believing about the world around them. Here's an example of folklore from Danielle Clayton's The Bells. The Bells is absolutely some of the best fantasy world building that I've read in the past few years. And if you haven't read The Bells yet, I highly recommend it. It's just intricate and immersive and atmospheric and such a delight to read. And so here's a little bit of folklore that explains the way the characters understand how their world came to be. The god of the sky fell in love with the goddess of beauty after the world began. Sky showered beauty with gifts of his loveliest objects, the sun, the moon, the clouds, the stars. She accepted his offer to be his wife, and together they had the children of Orleans. But Beauty loved her new children so much, she spent all her time with them. After she refused to return home, Sky sent rain and lightning and wind to drown the first humans. When Beauty protected the people from harm, Sky cursed them with skin the color of a sunless sky, eyes the shade of blood, hair the texture of rotten straw, and a deep sadness that quickly turned to madness. In return, Beauty sent the bells to be roses growing out of the dark and ravaged soil, destined to bring beauty back to the damned world as the sun brings light. So as I begin wrapping up with just a few minutes to go, I want to leave you with some resources, starting with some books that are exceptional examples of world building, because there is no better way to learn about world building than to look at authors who've done it extraordinarily well. So I have examples from each of the three categories I talked about earlier. Here are books with secondary worlds, completely made up worlds, with extraordinary world building. As I mentioned, there is The Bells. There's also The Sorcery of Thorns, one of my most favorite books that I have read recently. When people ask me if there is a fantasy world that I would like to live in or be a part of, it's the world from Sorcery of Thorns. You have magical libraries, magical books with personalities and attitude, and really what more could a writer want? And of course, there's also Aaron Craig's House of Salt and Sorrows. If you haven't read it yet, really recommend looking at that for an example of a society that's based, where their culture is based on the sea that they're surrounded by. And it's an amazing way to look at how you build a culture that's based on its surroundings. Books with amazing world building in historical and alternate worlds. So as I talked about Dread Nation, read the example of that. Again, a post-Civil War society where zombies are running amok across America. It is very, very well done. We Set the Dark on Fire. This is a Latin American based society where girls are sent to the Medio School for Girls. They're trained to be the wives of rich and influential men. Every man is given two wives, one to basically be the homemaker and the mother of his children, and another to be like his intellectual partner. And two girls who despise each other are sent to be wives of the same man. And what happens then? There's also Into the Heartless Wood by Joanna Ruth Meyer. This is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, gender swapped. So the girl is the monster. She is a tree siren. And She is discovered by a sweet cinnamon roll of a boy who is an aspiring astronomer, but gets sucked into this world of tree sirens who are wanting revenge against the kingdom who is infringing on their woods. And here are some contemporary fantasy books that also present some amazing world building. Wicked Fox by Kat Cho is set in modern day South Korea. It follows the Gumiho mythology of Korea. So Gumiho are fox spirit women who eat the souls of wicked men, and the main character comes across a young man and who is not wicked, but their lives ended up being at stake, and she has to decide, is she going to protect her immortal life, or is she going to protect this mortal boy who she has fallen for? A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow. It was released last summer. It has a thoroughly fascinating approach to incorporating a lot of characters from ancient mythology, especially Greek mythology, into a very modern contemporary world, full of a lot of modern day issues and concerns, including Black Lives Matter. And it's just an amazing way to build a contemporary fantasy world with elements that are very familiar to us from the mythologies we all grew up with. And there's also, as I mentioned, Cindy Baldwin's The Stars of Lightning Ridge, Fallen Star Magic, Sister Story, Girls Looking for Their Forever Home. It is such a thought-provoking and poignant read. Definitely look at that one as well. And some resources on craft, fantasy world building questions on Patricia C. Reed's website. She has a very comprehensive list of questions that you might want to take a look at if you're building fantasy worlds. It's very long. You don't necessarily have to answer all of them, especially as you're doing your initial brainstorming, but it's amazing food for thought. Definitely look at that resource. Wonder Book by Jeff Vandermeer is a fun and detailed way to think about constructing new fantasy worlds. And on the masterclass website, N.K. Jemisin just put out a fantasy and science fiction writing class. It's on my next to watch because she is a queen of fantasy and speculative fiction. So I definitely recommend taking a look at her class as well. Why not learn from one of the masters? You can find me online. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may still have on world building. I'm on Twitter. I'm most active on Instagram right now. And I also have my website link. There's a field on my website where you can send me email messages through my website. And again, I'm happy to answer any more questions, and hope I gave you some good food for thought on building your own fantasy worlds. Thank you.